I was talking to a colleague of mine a few minutes ago of a real generative GPT story that happened just this morning. I'm on a leadership call just before coming on stage today. And some of you that may have been at RSA last week heard about an incident that happened with let's just say, a major cell phone developer, not Apple, whose engineers decided to put some source code into ChatGPT just to see what would happen, and immediately found the source code out in the wild. So internally, we wanted to write an email to all of our employees to let them know, hey, be careful about what you put in there because it goes into the public immediately. And before we could even finish the conversation, our VP of marketing had sent us all a draft of the email, and all he did was put into ChatGPT, write an email to employees about the danger of ChatGPT. And at the end of it, we had 5 paragraphs that were ready to be sent out with absolutely zero editing required. Can be very scary stuff. I'm going to talk to you today about exposure management. And it's a little bit of a different tack than what we just talked about. I was here a year ago. I had the pleasure of being here a year ago. And since I'm from Boston, I take any opportunity I can get to the great state of Florida and the great weather you guys have here. And last year we talked a little bit about automated security validation. And I think over the course of the last year, there have been a lot of buzzwords that have come about. The market has grown significantly. But really, it's all about being able to help protect those of you that are security professionals in the room from the bad guys getting into your environment, whether it be bad guys that are already inside your network, accessing data and accessing assets that they shouldn't be able to, or more often than not, people coming in from the outside into your environment. So we'll talk a little bit about exposure management and talk about a topic that's very important to us, which is security validation, which is how do you, in fact, limit that whole idea of exposure management. Those of you in the room who may follow Pentera on LinkedIn, we have a very creative chief marketing officer who publishes these cyber tunes. So if you're not already following Pentera on LinkedIn, please do, because what we try to do with these cyber tunes is, in a little bit of a joking way, put ourselves in the perspective of security practitioners, people that are really CISOs, heads of security, and the challenges that you all have to work with and deal with on a regular basis. So here we have an S3 flasher coming down the street, and somebody saying, what the hell is that? And the other guy saying, don't sweat it. It's just another exposed S3 bucket, which demonstrates a couple of things. One is the fact that this whole concept of exposure management is becoming more and more pervasive. Every day you're reading about some exploit or something that's happened out there in the world that should have been prevented, should have been able to have been prevented. And so it's becoming very commonplace. And again, as security practitioners, it's really our job to make sure that we're putting everything in place that we can in order to protect the enterprises that we're charged to protect. The reality is the industry is doing a pretty poor job at keeping up financially with the losses that we're seeing out there. If you look over time and you look at the bottom curve here, you're seeing the amount of money that people are spending on cybersecurity over the last few years, $172 billion. You can see that line. While it's great that it's moving up and to the right as people are realizing that they have to spend more and invest more into this market, the dotted yellow line at the top is really scary. That's the losses due to breaches that have occurred. So something is wrong here, right? This is not keeping up with the investment that's being made in the market. And we have to look at a different way of attacking this problem. Show of hands in the room, who was at RSA last week? How many? I think there were over 1,000 vendors that showed up there talking about their product and their solutions and how their solutions can help you create a more safe and secure environment. We have all kinds of different products out there dealing with multi-factor authentication, dealing with SIM, dealing with EDR, dealing with AV, everything imaginable. And the poor CIO or the poor CISO that has to step back and say, what do I do? Where do I go? Where do I invest? What kind of money? The reality is, up until this point in time, Most of the non-defensive money has been spent on managing and patching vulnerabilities. Every day you get an alert saying there's a new CVE, you have to go patch, you have to run a vulnerability scan, see which assets in your environment are vulnerable to this particular problem, and then you have to go fix it. Part of the reason that curve I showed a few slides ago is rising so fast is that it's becoming impossible to be patch perfect. It's becoming impossible to keep up with the daily releases of CVEs that are coming out and being able to figure out which ones do I have to go and patch immediately, which ones can wait, which ones are targeting critical assets or applications, which ones are not, in order to be able to apply the scarce resources that may exist. The other reality is that 80% of those exploits are coming out before the CVEs are published, which means you're vulnerable for a specific period of time. You have what we call a dynamic vulnerability, or a vulnerability that exists for which there is no patch available. So you can have the fastest patching remediation practice on the planet, but if there is no patch to fix the problem, your problem persists, your problem remains. So let's talk a little bit about why this vulnerability management approach is failing. And I want to make a point. I'm not for a minute saying that you do away with your vulnerability management practice. There's an important word on the slide, which is the word only. So people that are only looking at vulnerability management as the way that they're going to protect their infrastructure and their environment is something that is becoming more and more difficult to deal with. I mentioned it a second ago, this concept of static and dynamic vulnerabilities. The CVEs that you get, the alerts, the patches, the fixes that you have to go run, they only apply to these things called static vulnerabilities. In other words, there's a problem, we've written a solution for the problem, here's how you go fix it. It's the non-patchable security gaps that really cause the problems in most enterprises. These are the dynamic vulnerabilities. This is the upgrade to the firewall that happened last weekend, and the configuration wasn't hardened at the end, and we're letting something through. This was the contractor that was in a few weeks ago that we had to set up on an endpoint, and because they were doing some weird things with the infrastructure, we had to turn our EDR policies off for that one workstation, and we forgot to fix it after the contractor was done. It's the passwords that get leaked onto the dark web and the credentials that get leaked onto the dark web that no patching is going to help. It's poor password hygiene in your environment that lets people have a password of password 123 or Go Red Sox or whatever that causes problems in your environment, again, that no patching is going to be able to fix. Zooming in a little bit on one of those dynamic vulnerabilities is the whole idea of credential exposure. There are over 20 billion credentials out there that are in circulation. If you guys are like me, you get this alert every week that says, hey, better change your passwords because your username or your password was found on some credential leak on the dark web. If you're like me, most of us will do it for our banking applications, but we're not going to go through for the 300 other passwords that we know are out there and change. It's a real problem, and 60 to 70% of the people out there are reusing credentials. So when obviously when somebody finds a password for one account, they're going to try it on all of them. And the majority of breaches that are occurring these days are leveraging those leaked credentials. Okay, so it's something that you have to be able to figure out, how do I test my environment, how do I harden, how do I protect my environment against these things. The other important thing to realize is that most of us in the room who are taking a vulnerability management approach to dealing with exposure management think in terms of lists, right? You run a vulnerability scan, you get the high CVE scores up at the top, the low CVE scores at the bottom, and what do? You put the tickets into Jira, or you put the tickets in for your remediation team to go and patch where you start at the criticals and you work your way down. You never make it to the bottom because you don't have enough people, you don't have enough time before the next scan is run, and you now have more criticals that you have to go follow. Okay? The reality is hackers and attackers don't think in terms of lists, they think in terms of vectors. And what do we mean by that? We mean they look for vulnerabilities that might be lower down on the stack, vulnerabilities that they know you probably haven't gotten to yet, vulnerabilities that may be easier to exploit. And they'll exploit that vulnerability, and then they'll start moving around, and they'll start moving laterally in your environment. They'll start sniffing for passwords. They'll try to crack a password. They'll try to move a hash from one place to another. They'll try to decrypt things. They'll try to get privileged access to different accounts, eventually making their way through these vectors up and actually achieving some very high achievements, including things like being able to capture domain level credentials and take over what we call the keys to the kingdom. So what we have to do is we have to find a new way to look at managing this exposure. In this caption, the gentleman is saying, "What's that?" The lady is saying, "It says your company's attack surface. It says it's your company's attack surface, darling." So Swiss cheese, right? It's open all over the place, lots of holes. And exposure management is all about not necessarily filling all those holes, but it's filling the right holes at the right time. So the first thing you have to think about with exposure management is taking the attacker's perspective in what you're doing. I represent a company called Pentera. Pentera has been in the market for 5 years, founded by some of the smartest, most aggressive. Somebody was talking earlier about a hacker founder in the Israeli Defense Force. Those of you in the audience who've watched shows like Fauda, it's true. They're really that cool. All right, these guys are really good at building both offensive and defensive cybersecurity applications and programs. When Pentera does what it does, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, we're taking it not from a CVE list-oriented perspective. We're looking at the world from an attacker's view. And what we're trying to do is give you all, as the security practitioners in your environment, a tool which will allow you to test every defense you've invested your time and money in against those static and dynamic vulnerabilities to see what the bad guys could do if they were in your network, if they were in your environment, or if you were attacked from the outside. All with the attacker's perspective. Because remember, attackers think in vectors, right? We want, with exposure management, we want to be able to cut the head off the snake as early as we can in the attack. And the way we do that isn't by looking at CVEs and starting at the top and working our way down towards the bottom. The way we do that is by actually acting like a human adversary would act in your environment, taking advantage of the lower level vulnerabilities that might exist, either static or dynamic, trying to stop those by prioritizing those for you to go fix. So we're going to tell you, don't stop with CVE on the 10 O's, go down lower, solve this one, because if you solve this one, you're going to prevent all these other things from happening. Okay? And that's the objective of exposure management. So it is all about this attacker's path. And the question is, how do you know what it is? How do you know what the path that an attacker is going to take in your environment? And that's where the concept of security validation comes into play. I talked about our great marketing CMO that we have at the company who developed these cyber tunes. Another great thing that we've done is come up with this term security validation, which is effectively penetration testing. It's, if you want to go back a few years and you want to look at the root of what we do as a company, Now, obviously, we do a lot more than that today, but at its core is the ability to validate and test your defenses. You're all going to say, we're doing penetration testing now. Does it mean that I'm safe? And I'd argue that you probably aren't. Because most organizations out there are running penetration testing tests maybe once a quarter. Most of you are probably doing it once a year. If you're transacting any kind of business using credit card information, you have PCI requirements that force you to run penetration testing for the security of the information of your customers. But even that's only once a year. And so the reality is that you get this line that happens over time, right? You run a penetration test, your security risk level goes down, everything's cool, but the day after the pen test is run, it's basically invalid. You're going to have somebody new connecting to the network that wasn't connecting yesterday, that has something wrong with their endpoint, or their endpoint isn't configured properly. You're going to have, as I said before, a change in your network environment, a new application that's rolled out in your environment that may have their own set of vulnerabilities attached to it. And so gradually your risk increases until you run your next penetration test. The idea is you want to be able to do this continuously, and there is no reason why you can't do that. I said Pentera is a company, we make a platform that does continuous automated security validation. All right, and so with our product, what you're doing is, first of all, we're acting like the adversary. We have this vector-based approach that's going to go and try to do everything the bad guys would do. We're vector-driven, as I said, and the results that you're going to get at the end of the day are going to be prioritized not by the CVE score, but by the actual things that we were able to accomplish, the achievements in your network, in your environment. And the last thing I'll say is that we give you the ability to do this. So unlike the slide a few slides ago where we talked about the risk curve, a lot of the times the penetration testing is actually not done by you. You hire a third party to come in and run the tests, and then they go away. We give you the ability, we're not a services company, we're a software company, to run those tests whenever you want. Because we feel it's important that either on a monthly or a weekly basis, you're pushing the go button and you're seeing what's going on in your environment. I talked a little bit about the attacker's perspective. So what does the attacker's perspective look like? Any of you in the room who have done ethical, I'm sure ethical hacking in the past, know what the steps are, right? You're going to go in, you're going to do an initial recon. You're going to see what's going on in there. You're going to try to get some sort of initial compromise one way, shape, or form. It could be by exploiting a known vulnerability that hasn't been patched. It could also be just by listening on the wire and seeing a password and username in clear text that comes by for some strange reason. But you want to get that initial compromise to establish a foothold in that environment. Once you get the foothold in there, you want to try to escalate your privileges, right? Because chances are the credentials that Bob, the receptionist, has are not going to get you to marry the CEO's critical files in her laptop. You want to gradually try to escalate privileges, and you want to start this cycle over and over again of hanging out, doing more recon, moving laterally, hanging out, listening some more, and eventually you're going to get to where you want to get to. Driven by a human, this process, one, takes a long time, and we're saying normal engagements for a human-driven penetration test anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, where they're going to be on your premise doing this. The second thing is it's very limited in scope because you can't do this across an enterprise. It's just too hard to do it across an enterprise. And the whole idea of automation comes into play. And yes, Pentera does have an automation engine that drives everything that we do, but so do the bad guys, by the way. So those of you that are saying, well, you can never automate or you shouldn't automate this type of validation as it relates to exposure management, and the answer is, if you don't do it, somebody else is. And you might as well do it because the bad guys are doing it today. And here's some examples of some of the automation that exists today in the wild related to validation and trying to do automated exploits. This isn't a new idea. right? The idea of bringing together the offensive security world, or the red teaming, and the defensive security world, the blue teaming, together, what we call purple teaming now in larger enterprises, is this idea of running, you're talking about tabletop exercises a minute ago, talking about trying to make sure that you are ready for the attack. One thing I say to CIOs and CISOs when I meet them is, I really don't know how you sleep at night. I don't know how people are getting a good night's sleep knowing that the phone is going to ring at any point in time saying, got to tell you, we just had a breach and you need to get down here right away. And it's these purple teams and products like Pentera that allow you to know what to do when that happens and hopefully prevent that from ever happening along the way. So hopefully you leave here this morning after listening to me speak with you for almost my allotted time about you're going to think about how resilient your organization really is. I would ask you to take a look at every layer of your security infrastructure and try to imagine what the worst thing that could possibly happen to your organization in every one of those layers, and realize that it doesn't matter how high you build those walls. It really doesn't. The bad guys are going to figure out a way around it. And your job should be to make sure that you're at least protecting the most critical assets that you have in your environment by knowing how they're going to get there. You want to automate the attack behavior. And this is the Pentera wheel, we call it, the things that Pentera does when you hit go against a range of IP addresses in your infrastructure, or a set of domains and subdomains when you come from the outside. It's about running a vulnerability assessment. We want to see where a toehold can be gained. Sniffing credentials, cracking passwords, doing relay attacks, injecting real malware. There's no point in simulating an attack in your environment. You want to actually drop real malware so you can see how your defenses behave. Ransomware is a great example of that. We have a ransomware module that will test your infrastructure's ability to react to ransomware attacks. We actually encrypt data. Not your data, data that we provide to make it safe, but looking at how your EDR will respond to that and how your NDR will react to those types of activities in your environment is something that we do. And continuing to go all around the circle. And this is something that we want to be able to do on a continuous basis. In closing, I want to say, first of all, thank you for your attention for the last 20 or 30 minutes or so. Think of this as a different way of achieving the result, which is managing the exposure in your organization by applying automated security validation in your infrastructure. We're here all day. Please come talk to us if you get a minute. Love to chat. Thank you.